All right, so welcome to our last video for the respiratory system module. We're going to first begin with a review animation, and then we'll jump into how the nervous system controls respiration, and then we'll finish up with some diseases that can occur in the respiratory system. Okay? So to begin with, we'll just start with this animation.
Lungs are elastic infoldings of the body surface, sealed within the surrounding chest cavity, that are used to exchange gas between blood and air. Expansion or contraction of the chest cavity, accomplished by motion of the diaphragm, causes a corresponding expansion or contraction of the lungs. This, in turn, produces the inhalation of oxygen and the exhalation of carbon dioxide. The volume of air moved during each breath varies from person to person. During quiet breathing, about 500 milliliters of air moves in and out with each breath. The amount of air inhaled or exhaled during a normal breath is called the tidal volume. The lungs are divided into myriads of tiny sacs called alveoli, or singular, alveolus. The alveoli are surrounded by tiny, extremely thin-walled capillaries into which deoxygenated blood flows. When air enters the respiratory tract and reaches an alveolus, oxygen diffuses across the epithelium of the alveolus and the thin capillary wall into the blood within the capillaries, where it binds to hemoglobin. This process oxygenates the blood that leaves the capillaries. The alveolus functions as an interface between air and blood. That interface consists of a thin layer of epithelial cells, some extracellular fluid, and the wall of a capillary. The capillary wall is so thin that oxygen and carbon dioxide readily cross it. The bloodstream distributes the oxygen from the lungs to the tissues throughout the body. The bloodstream also delivers the carbon dioxide waste from the tissues back to the lungs for expulsion. What happens to the oxygen that enters the blood? Most of the oxygen binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells, although some oxygen is transported in the plasma. The binding of one oxygen molecule to hemoglobin causes a change in the shape of hemoglobin that allows it to bind 3 more oxygen molecules. No more oxygen molecules can bind after that, however, because hemoglobin has exactly 4 subunits, and each subunit can bind only 1 oxygen molecule. When blood encounters tissues at rest, hemoglobin unloads about 30% of the oxygen it carries to the tissues. If tissue activity increases, such as during exercise, hemoglobin releases about 60% of its oxygen to the tissues. What happens to the carbon dioxide that leaves the tissues? Most of it diffuses into the bloodstream, specifically into red blood cells. There, much of the carbon dioxide is rapidly converted to carbonic acid by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. The carbonic acid then dissociates, releasing a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, that is, a proton. As a result, the blood pH drops. Changes in pH affect the shape of hemoglobin and thus its ability to bind oxygen. Hemoglobin can bind less oxygen at lower blood pH and more oxygen at higher blood pH. The drop in blood pH leads to the unloading of oxygen by hemoglobin. The protons released by the dissociation of carbonic acid bind to deoxygenated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin thereby acts as a buffer, preventing large swings in blood pH. Thus, the bloodstream can transport carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate ions from the tissues to the lungs with a minimal effect on blood pH. When deoxygenated blood reaches the alveolus, the process is reversed. In the lungs, a concentration gradient favors the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the plasma and red blood cells to the alveolus. Bicarbonate is converted back to carbon dioxide, which then diffuses into the alveoli and is exhaled by the lungs. With the next inhalation, oxygen is picked up and the cycle continues.
Okay, so that was a pretty good overview of kind of everything we've talked about so far. Um, and now what we're going to look at is how the nervous system actually regulates breathing. Um, and so the kind of control center for the respiratory system is located in the medulla oblongata. And this portion of the brain actually establishes and regulates the breathing pattern. And so the neurons in the medulla are generating these electrical impulses that's being sent to the respiratory system kind of every 4 to 5 seconds, which is telling the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm to contract and relax. And so this regulates that rate of breathing. And so whenever your rate of breathing increases or slows down, the neurons in this area are slowing down or speeding up the generation of those impulses. So if you have a disorder that kind of affects these or affects the impulses that's being sent or the transmission of these impulses, then it's going to affect your ability to undergo respiration at an appropriate rate, which could be really bad. Now, there are receptors in the medulla oblongata that monitor carbon dioxide levels. And the way it monitors the carbon dioxide levels is through the presence of hydrogen ions. And so it's not measuring carbon dioxide directly, it's actually getting an indirect measure. Because if you remember, right, when carbon dioxide goes into the blood, it binds with water in the hemoglobin, turns into carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid releases a hydrogen ion, turning into bicarbonate. So if you have a lot of carbon dioxide, then you will get a rise, or you will have a lot of hydrogen ions in the bloodstream. And so the medulla oblongata can look at that, can look at the amount of hydrogen ions, and it can indirectly determine whether or not the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is remaining the same, increasing, or decreasing. And monitoring the carbon dioxide indirectly this way is primarily how our nervous system regulates the rate of respiration. Our body does also monitor the presence of oxygen and the partial pressure of oxygen. This is done actually at the aortic and carotid bodies, so the vessels, and they directly monitor that partial pressure of oxygen. If the partial pressure of oxygen decreases by about 20%, then these bodies will become activated, and it will lead to an increase in our respiration rate. So you'll get an increase of your rate, and not only the rate, but the depth of breathing. So how strong or how large those breaths are. And so the regulation of respiration is determined by the need to get rid of carbon dioxide out of our bloodstreams, which is indirectly measured by the presence of hydrogen ions, rather than the need to actually obtain oxygen. So again, that's really, leads back to the idea that the regulation of the respiration rate is directly tied to how much carbon dioxide is in the bloodstream. Now, we do have a conscious control over our respiration rates. We can modify it as we talk, as we sing, as we vocalize, communicate, etc. We can hold our breath, but we only can do that temporarily. Eventually, we'll get to a point to where our body will override that voluntary control, and then the automatic controls will kick in. And cause us to undergo breathing, even if we're trying to hold that breath. So here's a figure showing kind of how this relationship exists in terms of the medulla oblongata regulating the respiratory rate. So you have the medulla oblongata, which is the respiratory center, right? And then it controls or determines the rate of breathing, right, which is shown by the connection to the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm muscles by indirectly responding to those changes of hydrogen ions. But also remember there are receptor cells in the carotid arteries as well as the aortic artery or the aorta that that detects oxygen concentration, and it really needs a large decrease. We're talking about a 1/5 drop in oxygen in order for these bodies to stimulate a response to the medulla oblongata. And so just to finish up, we're going to go through some respiratory system disorders. Some of the more common ones that you'll come across are, asthma, emphysema. So asthma is where you have a contraction of the bronchi, so those passageways for the air. And this kind of reduces the amount of airflow into the lungs, and it makes you feel like you can't breathe. This could be caused by allergic responses, and we can control those through inhalers, which will cause the bronchi to dilate and not to constrict, and specific steroids that also help with that. Emphysema is where the alveoli are permanently impaired or permanently damaged, and you feel like you can't catch your breath because you have a decreased surface area for gas exchange. So remember, we said the average is about 800 square feet for that surface area. And so if that's reduced, that reduction will decrease the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide that's diffusing in and out of the bloodstream, and that can make you feel like you're not able to catch your breath. So a lot of cases of emphysema are a direct result of smoking, but there could be some other causes to that as well. Other ways you can get reduced airflow or gas exchange is through bronchitis, which is just an inflammation of the bronchi. This could be acute or chronic. It could be related to stuff that you breathe in. So it could be air pollution, it could be smoking. And so that's just causing an inflammatory response in the bronchi that's constricting the passageways, that's causing a reduction in the amount of airflow that you get. Another one is cystic fibrosis. This is actually a genetic condition. It's inherited. And what ends up happening is you get a really thick mucus lining in the lungs, which decreases the amount of airflow that's coming into the lungs themselves. And that can lead to side effects such as really frequent pulmonary infections. And because you're, reduced airflow over a consistent amount of time, other organ systems can be affected due to cystic fibrosis as well. A lot of you have probably heard of these upper respiratory infections. These are pretty common. So you get these with like your colds and your flus. Viruses generally cause these. So antibiotics are not effective because antibiotics only really affect bacteria. And so you just kind of have to let these pass, kind of go on their way. Depending on the type of infection, it could have a lot of different symptoms associated with that. Another infection of the lungs that are caused by viruses and also bacteria is pneumonia. Pneumonia is a pretty big cause of death in the U.S. It's one of the top 10 causes of death, and has even been a bigger concern with the rise of COVID and how COVID can lead to pneumonia. And then the cause of the pneumonia, whether it's bacterial based or virus based, determines the type of treatment that you're going to get in response to that infection. Other infections that you can get are tuberculosis or botulism. So tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that leads to a lot of scarring on the lungs. It can be an active infection that shows symptoms, or it can be a dormant infection that will just reactivate later. And so you can have it and not have any symptoms. The way you'll diagnose this is to get a tuberculosis skin test and a chest x-ray. And then because it is bacterial, you would treat this with antibiotics. Botulism is a toxin that's released by bacteria that actually cause a poisoning, and it's generally caused by consuming food that's not been prepared or preserved properly, and it can lead to a paralysis of your skeletal muscles. So other skeletal muscles are your intercostal and your diaphragm muscles, or not skeletal muscles, but other muscles, right, are including the intercostals and the diaphragms, right, which are your skeletal muscles. There we go. I can finally talk, I guess. And so if those are paralyzed, then you're not going to be breathing, which can be fatal. So that's a really big issue if that ever comes up. Another big disease of the lungs is cancer. So lung cancer is a really big cause of death in the U.S. 1/3 of all U.S. cancer deaths are due to or come from lung cancer. And so some of the symptoms that arise from lung cancer are impairing of your airflow because of the tumor inside the lungs, which can also prevent gas exchange, reduce the amount of gas exchange. It could reduce the blood flow into the lungs. And so if you don't have a sufficient blood supply to the lungs, then that blood's not being filled with oxygen and the carbon dioxide's not being exchanged. So that could be really bad for the functioning of the organs and other tissues. And 90% of the cases of lung cancer are associated with smoking. But there are other factors that can lead to lung cancer. So one is radon gas, another one is asbestos, which is a chemical that was in a lot of workplace environments, but now there are regulations kind of going away from those chemicals that have asbestos. But if you're a little older, you could have been exposed to this potentially in a workplace environment. And so it has been shown or has been related to incidences of lung cancer. So here's a normal lung on the top compared to a lung of somebody who has smoked and has cancer. You can see that large tumor up in the top. You can see kind of the dead alveoli sacs throughout the lungs. And you can actually see in this image where some of those alveoli are filled with blood, which is that dark area here. And notice in the healthy, those alveoli are clear, surrounded by healthy looking blood. So those blood capillaries. So you can just kind of really see the difference there between those two types or those two lungs. Another deadly cancer in the lungs is mesothelioma. So this is actually cancer in the lining of the lungs, the heart, and the abdomen, so the abdominal area. This is directly related to asbestos exposure. So most of these cases are going to be from asbestos exposure. Generally, symptoms from asbestos show up about 20 to 50 years after exposure. So you don't really catch it until it's well established, usually in your later stages of cancer. And we'll learn about the different stages of cancer when we talk about cancer in that chapter. And the life expectancy after diagnosis averages anywhere from 8 to 14 months. And that's because, it is so well established generally when you catch it. Usually it's stage 4, it's metastasized, it's spread throughout the body. And so it's really detrimental, really fatal when it gets to that stage. So some final ones are an pneumothorax, which is just where one of your lobes in your lungs collapses. Usually this is due to a wound that's penetrated the body, penetrated the lung, and led to an inability of that lung to inflate. And so since it can't inflate, then you don't have appropriate gas exchange. And so what you would do is you would just remove the air from the pleural cavity, and then that would help to reinflate the lung. And then you have atlostasis or atlasitasis, and that's a lack of gas exchange because the alveoli are collapsing, or you have fluid building up in the alveoli. And so this isn't allowing the alveoli to take in enough air so that the air can be exchanged at that blood level, that capillary interface. And so if that space is taken up by the fluid, you're not having that sufficient exchange of oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out. So it can be a result of complication from surgery, or because you don't have that surfactant. So you have a deficient surfactant that helps increase the surface tension on the alveoli and to keep them inflated. And then the last disease we want to talk about is just congestive heart failure. We mentioned this in the last chapter when we talked about heart, or the heart, and it's basically where your heart becomes less efficient. We said one of the side effects of this is that it can affect lung function. And so if you have a failure of the left side of the heart, then the blood pressure increases in the pulmonary capillaries, and you get fluid buildup in the pulmonary interstitial spaces in the alveoli. And again, we just talked about what that fluid buildup can do. And so that leads to an impaired gas exchange. And so the way you would treat this is you would try to get the heart pumping effectively again to improve the pumping action of the heart. And you would want to get that fluid removed out of the alveoli. Okay. And so that's it for our respiratory chapter. As always, let me know if you have any questions. If you have any concerns, you can contact me through email, through the discussion boards in the class Canvas, and we will see you in the next module.